Today I will, recording in progress, it said that out loud. Today I will talk to you guys a little bit about memory biases and risky choice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of kind of a base introduction to the type of problem. And then what I want to do is talk about kind of three sets of recent results that we have from the last couple of years that talk a little bit about how we think what's going on in these types of repeated decisions from experience. So before I start, I'd like to thank my collaborators who have been involved in almost all aspects of this work. Marcia at Spetch at University of Alberta, Alice Mason, a postdoc of mine who's at University of Warwick, and Chris Madan, my collaborator over at Nottingham. So to get you started in the right mindset, what I want you to do is I want you to think about a very easy question, a question that you may have heard many times before in different varieties. I see that I actually have a picture up of our late queen. I didn't actually plan that, but it's a little bit of a memorial. The day after the very long queue came to an end. So I think for a minute about what you might prefer. Would you rather have 20 pounds or whatever currency is relevant in your part of the world? Would you rather have 20 pounds for sure? Or would you rather take a 50-50 chance and take a gamble of winning 40 pounds? So just to get you in the right mindset, think about that, what you would do in that sort of circumstance, tossing a coin, playing roulette, any number of random generating processes that you might have. Of course, when we ask people that, people have been doing this for a long time. Most people, though not everybody, will choose the gains in that situation. Now, if I flip it around and I ask you the exact same question, then I ask you in terms of losses, would you rather lose 20 pounds for sure, or take a 50-50 chance of losing 40 pounds? It's always hard to think about losses in that exactly that sort of way, but you might think of, paying for something or taking a chance of getting a parking ticket, any number of things that fit in that sort of way. But think about that for a second, and most people share the intuition that we know very well, that in that case, you'd be much more willing to take the gamble of actually losing the amount. So this is, of course, a very, very classic effect that people have known for a long time. This is just one version of data. People tend to be risk averse for gains, and they tend to be risk seeking for losses when you're dealing without rare problems, with common probabilities, like 50%, like the one I was just giving. But of course, how often, other than in these sorts of talks, do people come up to you and really ask you that sort of question? How often are you given the choice between a guaranteed amount and a guaranteed set of probabilities? This might happen at a casino, right, in some situations. And there are a couple of world-like situations where that happens. But most of the decisions we make in life and most of the decisions that we make about outcomes and uncertainty rely on our own experience, whether it is slot machines, stock market, or even the example I gave before of deciding whether or not to actually put a little bit of money into a parking meter or risk getting a parking ticket. In all those cases, you don't know what the underlying odds are. You might have some experience with that, and you possibly don't even know what the outcomes are. You don't even know how big the ticket would be that you would get if you didn't do it in a lot of situations. So when you do that, that's obviously ends up being very different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what we call our doors task, but this is the way that we've tried to translate that sort of natural decision from experience into something that we can control and manipulate and ask questions about in the lab to try and get a sense of the mechanisms that push people to make these sorts of decisions. So here's an example of one of the tasks that we use. And in this case, it's exactly the same as the two questions I just asked you, except people do not have the odds in front of them. So here they would play a game and they would see in front of them either a red door and a yellow door. If they picked the red door, they would always get 20. If they picked the yellow door, half the time they get 0, half the time they get 40. That would be a gain case. They have a loss case, again, very similar. Green door would give you a loss of 20, and the other one would give you a 50-50 chance of 40. So exactly the problem set that I just gave you before with the two described problems, but translated into experience. And that's kind of the basic kind of decision problem that we're going to work with, the protocol that we're going to use to try and extract a little bit more about how people make these sorts of decisions from experience. So to start you off, just to show, so here's an example using the exact problem that I gave, what it looks like with described data. People tend to be, on average, about 10 to 15% more risk-seeking for losses than gains. And if you ask those exact same people at the exact same time, intermingled, you actually get a reversal. So they're actually about 10 to 12% in the opposite direction when they actually learn about it from experience. And this is with a lot of experience, and they've had a couple hundred rounds when we're looking at this. So you can be pretty certain that they have a good sense. And in fact, I'll show you later, but when we ask them, a lot of them are actually able to articulate that it was actually 50-50 odds, yet nonetheless, they actually behave differently in those two situations. So it's a type of description experience gap. It's a little bit different than what some other people who I know are in the audience now have studied for a long time. And that's the description experience gap with rare events. But this is without rare events. In this case, it's 50-50 odds, yet they behave differently. So why do they end up with this sort of difference? And of course, this is going to push me to really ask the question of what are people doing in experience, which is the direction I'm going to go, that yield that makes them behave differently than they might, and the intuition that you had at the beginning behave in those sorts of 50-50 problems. So one idea that we've had, and this is the idea that we've been playing with for a while, is the idea that a core component or the core cognitive process that seems to be driving this sort of behavior is a memory process. And in some ways, it's obvious that, you know, when you're relying on experience, you have to rely on your memory, right? All you have available to you are the memories of the past outcomes, right? So there's something going on with those memories of past outcomes that's going on. The idea that we've had is that what tends to happen in these sorts of situations is that people tend to remember the best and the worst things that happen to them, right? So they come into the lab, they have this sort of experience, and whatever, you know, it's kind of the experience that they have defines the space of possibility. And I think that's a very general thing about the world, right? That one of the things, and people outside the lab and in general are very much or very often very obsessed with extremes. They want to know the highest, the fastest, the longest. We love world records. We love these sorts of things, right? And in some ways, they define the range of possible experience, right? So these extremes not only matter when we're talking to bringing them into the lab and they're contextually defined in that sort of way, but I think this is something very fundamental about the way that we understand the world, right? In order to know what's possible, we have to know the range of what's possible. And we're very influenced by that. So how does that play out when you start thinking about decisions from experience and any other way of relating to from experience? So to go back to our little toy problem that we were working with, so you have gain trials, which are right, +20 against 0-40, loss trials, which are -20 against -40 and 0. And you'll see that in this case, in the world that I presented to these participants, the biggest thing that they see is -40, the smallest thing that they see is +40. That's the range of experience. That's the world that they have when they walk into the lab. And we think what's going on is that as people encounter these sorts of things, for instance, the red door with a win of 40, they selectively store those. They selectively remember in such a way that they tend to remember more strongly the times or the instances, or not necessarily instances, so I'll come back to a little bit of exactly the content of that memory, but they tend to remember better, let's put it that way, the biggest outcomes that happen and the worst outcomes that happen. And so why do we think that? Okay, so first of all, when we actually look at people's memory in these sorts of tasks, so we're doing, we do it in a couple of different ways. And so the first thing that we do, right, so we have them play this game, right, of the sort that I just explained. And then at the end, we ask them a couple of different questions. One of the questions we'll ask them is, what's the first outcome to come to mind, right? Right. So that's just one of the ways to elicit perhaps which of the possible outcomes is more accessible. And when we do that, people tend to report the more extreme outcome. So on the plot on the left there shows how people tend to report 40 more often than 0. And as might be imagined, those people who report 40 are more risk-seeking than those people who report 0. We get the exact same effect when we look at losses. The effect is even more pronounced in that case, right? That people tend to, when you ask them, that you show them a picture of the door and you say, do you remember the 0? Which one do you want to say first? they'll report the minus 40 much more frequently. And those people who report the minus 40 are gamble much less often than the people who reported 0. Okay, so it's both that they remember it and it actually relates to what they have done, what they did in the past.
Elliot, maybe I can ask extreme with 40-0. I think 40 is an extreme outcome, but 0 is the other extreme outcome. So
that's a good question. And the way we do this is that they're intermingled. We'll come more about that, of exactly how that works out. But they have these problems together, right? They'll have one set of, right? They'll have all the red, yellow, blue, green doors coming in one session. So the 0 in the session, and so that's a good question. What defines the context? Is it just the problem itself? Is it the whole hour that they're in the lab, or however long they're there for, 20 minutes, depends on the experiment? Or is it, you know, every psychology experiment they ever did, or, right, what is the range of things that they're using? So in this case, it seems to be they're using what they've experienced in the course of that experiment. And we've played with that a little bit, and I'll tell you more of some experiments that we've done to try and pull that out a little bit more carefully. So good question. The other way that we've asked about it is in terms of frequency judgments. So we've also asked people at the end to say, how often did these happen? Now, remember, people have experienced this 50-50. So we asked them, and people tend to report, I'll put up both gains and losses at the same time here. Again, the effect is slightly bigger with losses, but people will judge the frequency of the 40 and the minus 40 as being higher than the 0. And the other thing is that it correlates with their choice, right? So the judged percent correlates with their choice. As you'll see, there's actually, if you look at the graph on the right, there's a string of people right along the middle, and those are the people who actually are correctly able to identify the 50-50. Exactly on the nose, and there's a fair number of them. They still show the same effect in the behavior, as in they are still more risk-seeking for gains than for losses. And I don't have that here, but they even that subset of people tend to report the extreme when you do the first outcome. So they might know that it's 50-50, but then when you push them, you say, which one do you want to say first? They still say the extreme and their behavior otherwise. So yeah, okay. So one piece of evidence, we have a whole bunch of different experiments that actually kind of confirms that it is the extremes that matter. One of the things that we did is we did an experiment a few years ago where we took out the losses and only used gains. Okay, so now in this case, we have the low problem is the same as the gain one, right? Now it's plus 20 against 0 and 40, same one as before. But now I also have another problem that's the high problem, that's plus 40 against 60, 80. Okay, so now the extremes have become 0 and 80. Okay, so that's the idea. The extremes are now 0 and 80. 40 is no longer an extreme. Now what happens, or what, the idea would be, if it is the extremes, the low one should now reverse. And what they should do in this case is they should be risk averse in the low one, even though they were slightly risk seeking before, or just over 50, and they should be risk seeking for the high ones. And that's precisely what we see. We see a very nice, essentially complete reversal if you present the problem in the context of other types of problems. Okay, so that brings me to the question. This actually relates to Peter's question very well. First, I'll give an answer in summary. The extreme outcomes, the biggest and the smallest, are overweighted in choice, and they're better remembered. So now we're going to come to our first recent experiment that really gets at the question of, well, what defines that context, right? What is this space of things that they are taking into consideration when they actually make those decisions? Okay, and so one possibility is that they are taking into account the global experimental context, everything that they see in the lab since they come here. The second possibility is that they actually have a much narrower, more local context that they're actually using. And so how do we do that? How do we actually try and tease apart what they're actually using to determine what range of things they're using when they're actually making their decision? So here's the design that we use. It's very similar to the design before. It's a little more complicated on this figure because there's more conditions. Okay, so the top row is our gain loss context. So this is the same 4 doors as before, except now they're outdoors. Okay, so you see there's an outdoor context. And in this case, we use slightly different numbers, but again, we have a loss and a gain case. Okay, so we have lost numbers and we have gain numbers. No zeros, they're not overlapping. Try to control for a couple other things that might have been an issue in the earlier ones. Okay, so you have a loss case and you have a gain case. That's in the outdoor context with the doors. In the indoor context with the gifts, so then you have a second set where you're now opening gifts and then you get the outcomes. Again, this is all through repeated choice. You open it, you see what happens, you do it again. And you get different recombinations of the different options. So in the indoor context, the gains are now the low value option, and then there's a higher value option beside it. Okay, so similar to what we did across experiments up until this point, but now we did it with a single group of people within one experiment. And so they would do, let's say 40, 50 choices in the outdoor case, and then we would switch the context and they would do 40, 50 choices in the indoor case, and we go back and forth. So they would do a handful of choices in each context, then we would go back and forth and then see what they do. Now, the key question of interest, of course, is going to be what they're going to do on those gain low value ones, which are exactly the same, right? So now they're getting the exact same experience, making the exact same choices, but in a different context. So what you see here is, well, you get actually a fair difference of about 15–20% between the exact same choice in the two different contexts, right? So this suggests that it's actually the local extremes that really matter. Right, that what they're doing in this case is in one context, they're saying, okay, well, in this context, I know it goes from -30 to +30. I remember all these -30s. I remember all these +30s. And in the other context, they're like, oh, I remember all these +10s and I remember these +70s, and I behave accordingly. So for the exact same choice, and this is in the same session, with alternating blocks. The only difference is whether they're in the indoor or outdoor context. Similarly, we get an effect of extremes on the memory. And so in this case, what we also see is the extremes in each context are overreported in the memory. So now here, this is a plot of this is for the first outcome reported. We see similar things for the frequency, but it's easier and cleaner to plot like this. But for the first outcome reported, so you can see those are the two kind of orangish red ones. In the top row is the context where it was a gain, right? So here you had 10 versus 30. In that context, they slightly say 30 more than 10. It's kind of similar. It's not much of an effect in that case. But in the low context, for the exact same choice, there's a massive effect going the other way, where they are about 3 times more likely to say 10 than 30. And so this also impacts what they are willing to say when you show them the doors or the gifts from the indoor and from the outdoor context. And so the main conclusion that we want to draw from this point is about what context defines the extremes, right? When you're thinking about what, is it the overall world record? Probably not, right? So people are a little bit more narrowly defined in that it really depends. They can they're making the choice within the. It's not just the choice, right? It's they're not just looking at the two options available to them, and therefore both are, both the high and the low are necessarily extreme. They're looking at the choices in that given context. So that's one point that we wanted to make. The other thing that we did in that experiment is we did a variation on it, where what we did is after the experiment, we switched the context. So for this one, it was the same thing as the design with the doors and the outdoor and the gifts in the indoor, except this time what we did is we had 2 different outdoor contexts and 8 different doors. So similar idea, just a minor variation. So that way we can actually sensibly switch the contexts after learning, right? Putting the gifts outside the doors indoor didn't quite work, but it was just in terms of the narrative and having people follow along. So what we did is we switched the context after learning. And the idea is that this would help us disentangle whether it was encoding or retrieval, right? The idea being that if what matters, and there's several theories out there that suggest that what you're doing when you're making these choices is you might be sampling from your memory. And if what matters is the context at the time of retrieval, then your choice should depend on the context, not what you learned, not where you learned it originally, right? So that would be the logic in that case, right? So the idea is that if we're going to switch contexts, if what's going on is that what you're doing when you're making this choice is you're sampling, right, based on the context of retrieval, then we should see a flip when we switch contexts. If what's going on is it happens at encoding, that what matters is the context of encoding determines what your choice, and you're not going to see much of a difference. And in fact, so this is what we did. So this is when we did the test context, we did it without any feedback so that we wouldn't teach them anything new. When we switched them to the same context, so now here what I've done is I've only pulled out the two doors that were identical. Now remember there were two doors that were identical, right? One is one was the gain door against the loss. One was the low door against the higher value door. All right, so this is what we did when we kept it in the same context. Okay, well, it didn't really change the behavior. This is what I showed you before. And that they were more risk-seeking for the gains than for the low value, about 20-odd%. And then when we move them into the other context, well, there's actually no effect. And it's about as small a no effect as I've ever seen, as in it was within 0.5% on both those numbers, which is why they look the same. But it was very, very close. In any case, the point being is that seems to indicate that actually the context of retrieval really doesn't seem to matter when people are making these choices. Whatever they're doing during encoding, they're learning about these different options and deciding which one they want and how often they might want to select it. That carries forward into whatever other context that you switch them over to. So it's not the case that they're sitting there in a context and retrieving the items from that context and determining what's higher or lower. It's really about what happens when they encode it. So what we think what's going on is that, this is why I put the little bias here in terms of when it was being stored in memory, that it's context dependent, but it's context dependent in the sense that it depends on the other items that are happening at the same time in that context when you're learning about it. So as people are learning, they're using the context around them or they're not necessarily using it. The context around them helps determine what is more memorable, whether things actually get encoded such that later it is retrieved. Okay, so that is one.
Elliot?
Yeah.
Can I get a short question?
Yeah.
You call these memory biases and experience, and did you ever check for the memories of people when they choose from description? Or did you get something different?
I've never really thought about how to do it from description.
Let them choose from description, then ask the same questions as you do after they choose from experience. And maybe they'd report the same.
It's a good question.
Is it memory really then?
So you'd have to do it after they choose. The problem is, how do you tell them, right? How do you elicit that memory without just giving them the description again? Right. So one of the things that we're asking them is make a frequency judgment. And how do I do that? You know, here's an option where you have a 50-50 chance of this happening. What is the chance of this happening? It's kind of like a redundant. I'm not sure how to elicit that. So we haven't done it. Not to say that we couldn't. There might be a way to actually show this.
First outcome retrieved, right? You have that. What's the first outcome retrieved?
First outcome retrieved again, but I guess you could just show them, okay, here's a 50-50 option. You're either going to get, right, you're choosing between this one and this one. When you think about this option, what's the first thing to come to mind? Yeah, I guess you could do that. I mean, that's sort of the query theory type way of looking at how people kind of pull things up and, you know, evaluate possible reasons, I guess, in some sort of way. We've never done that. That's an interesting question. So the first outcome, I guess you could do the frequency judgment. I'm not sure how. I do not know what people would say if you showed them a decision problem with 50-50 outcomes in a range of other problems or not in a range of other problems, and ask them, what's the first one that you think about, or the first one to come to mind, or however you want to put it. It's not quite a memory problem at that point, right? It is more of a, it's an evaluation, but you're right. There might be a similar bias. Well, I don't necessarily it might not be a memory bias in that case, but a similar tendency towards either the higher or the lower. It might be opposite of what we see in experience. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know.
I think there are quite some studies to see how a particular choice is impacted by previous choices in the experiment, all kind of carryover effects. So in general, there's a lot. I don't know particularly to your question, but there is a lot of that.
Yeah, no, that also, right, when you have sets of repeated questions, that might also influence what you focus on the next on the next one.
I was just referring to the point about memory bias. Is it a memory bias, or is it just the tendency of people to report something?
I mean, is it a bias? I mean, depends what you mean by bias. Necessarily, I agree. It's not necessarily so. It's certainly a tendency. I call it a bias because it's non-veridical when it comes to the frequency. That's the reason I call it that. But it's not, you know, bias tends to imply error. So for the frequency it does. For the first outcome, there's no correct answer, right? So there's no sense in which there's an error to say one or the other. It has to just be a tendency. So it's more, it doesn't necessarily imply error on that. So I could have two different words for the two different things, but that would be not parsimonious. So I do go in that direction with the choice of the word bias, with caveats of exactly how it's being used. I know.
Elliot, I also have a question. It's about the crossover.
Yeah.
So you are claiming change of context, but I don't see how, you know, what is different in the context. Seems to me that this crossover, in terms of the attributes and cues that people would use in the new task, it would be pretty much the same as before, isn't it?
So the main thing that differs in the crossover case, right, is the background, right? The background images are completely different. And so.
But is that relevant to the decision?
Yes, because if you don't use the background images, we don't get these context effects. So
Okay.
I don't show that here, but it's in that paper, experiment 2A or 1B, I think it's 1B actually, where what we do there is we did it without any pictures in the background, and we just had, you know, the doors happening, and the only thing that differentiated them was the temporality of it. And if you do that, then you don't get any sort of context effect. So the pictures matter, right? They set the context. So they do matter because that's how you get the context effect, is because of the pictures. And then if you switch pictures, after, now remember, they've already done this a couple hundred times before we switch pictures, right? So to be fair, maybe if we had done it earlier or a different way, there might be the possibility of that sort of effect. But at least after they've done it a couple hundred times, it's, you know, in some cases burned in what they're choosing, and switching the context at that point, right, as in switching the background image, no longer influences their preference. And so that's that, yeah.
So I guess that brings another question, and that's the length of training. So how many trials before and how many they did in the crossover?
So if I remember right, and I won't remember right, I'd have to look at the paper to know the exact numbers. It was approximately 100 trials in each context, approximately, plus or minus, and then about 20 unreinforced or unrewarded trials, no feedback trials in the either the same or the crossover context.
So that's also a potential issue, right? So they have a lot more experience with the previous context, not with the new context, and you are averaging all your results.
Yeah, in the new context, they don't get any feedback. They don't learn anything new, right? So that's on purpose. Just what I wanted to see is if, or at least what we wanted to see there is if just switching the context, right, made a difference. Now, they could learn something new in that new context. That's true. I'm sure they could. But we wanted to see if just this context switch alone induced a shift in behavior. That didn't matter. Could you say maybe they didn't notice, maybe they were paying attention to the doors themselves? There's other possible interpretations, of course. But the fact that they also needed the context, right, the actual picture mattered for establishing the context effect, suggests to me that they did notice the pictures, but switching them was not sufficient. So it suggests to me that there is an encoding bit to it, that it matters what's happening when they are when they're actually learning. That kind of determines, they're kind of, I don't want to necessarily claim that it's that sort of way, but if they're estimating some sort of value for each of the options, then it's kind of locked in by the initial context, and you show it to them in a different context. They already have I like the red one better than the green one, right? I like the red one this much more than the green one by that point. So I think so it's something along those lines. I think that's what's happening in terms of how they make these choices with these sort of repeated play. Because remember, these repeated play ones, they have a lot of experience, right? I mean, 100 is not so many for these experiments, right? People do more than that even, but they do get a lot, right? So by the end of it, what are they, and it might be very different also what they're doing at the end than what they're doing at the beginning, right? At that point, right, at the beginning, they might be thinking, oh, it was this one, that one, I want to learn more information. By the end, they're like, oh yeah, red, green, red, right? They've already internalized their kind of choice pattern. So that's definitely possible.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of the story. And the next piece of the story is the question of what is actually being stored. What is actually being taken into memory when they are actually doing these experiments. And for this one, I'm going to talk about a recent paper with Alice that is in press, or maybe even has a publication date in Cognition that we just worked on. And it was a nice series of 3 experiments, of which I will tell you one of them. In this design, the main innovation we did as opposed to our previous experiments was, instead of giving a single outcome, we gave people a sample from a range. Okay, so now every time they picked the red door, instead of getting exactly 75 or whatever it was, they would get a number between 700 and 790. Right? For the yellow door, they'd either get a number between 500 and 590, or a number that was between 900 and 990. Right? So same design, right? 50-50, high, low, but now instead of exact numbers, they're getting numbers from a range. And so that's the basic idea. And what we see happens is, okay, so in terms of choice, we have a nice big effect in the same direction as before, where for the high value ones, they are about 20-25% more risk-seeking than the lower value ones. So in choice, it actually works very nicely. But then we asked them to recall. And the way we did this was a little different, because we asked them for free recalls in this case. So we basically said, okay, here's the red door. Tell me all the numbers that you remember that happened with the red door. And people did generate on a handful of numbers each person. However, they were terribly bad. And this is not so surprising. These people had just seen 200 numbers over the course of the experiment. And now you're asking them to remember what numbers are associated with the red door. Okay, that's fine. But they were terrible at those sorts of numbers, right? They were on the order of 1 in 50, 1 in 100 correct, depending on the exact experiment. Very, very poor in terms of correctness. However, I don't think I have the plot here. However, the numbers they did recall were about 70% in the correct ranges. So they were plausible numbers, just not the numbers that they actually saw. So they might have seen 813 and they're saying 823, right? So they were correct in the sense that most of the numbers that they generated were from the correct ranges for those numbers, but they weren't actually numbers that they had seen over the course of the actual experiment.
Were they more likely to report round numbers?
We didn't see that bias in the distribution. I can show you, I think on the, no, I don't think I have it with that granularity. We didn't see that, but they didn't report that many numbers. So no, we didn't tend to see a over representation of I know that, you know, there's prominent numbers, but they didn't seem to be using prominent numbers when they were trying to guess or generate the outcomes that they actually saw. What was interesting, or one of the things that was really interesting that they did in this case, is that the distributions of the outcomes that they actually saw matched very nicely that sort of overweighting that we had seen before. So now here's the recall distribution. And you can see that the numbers that they did recall were more often in the range in the 900s than in the 500s for the high value one, right? This is for the risky option. And they were more often in the 100 range than in the 500 range, right? So for the numbers that they did recall, they tended to be from the extreme range, even though those weren't actually numbers that they had seen in almost all instances. So that was very nice. Here's what it looks like in terms of the full distribution. I said this doesn't have the granularity for the question you're asking about, but you can see that it's pretty reasonably distributed through the range, and you can actually see that, you know, for the risky doors, where the gray bars are the actual ranges, and that's a histogram across all people of the frequency of reporting different numbers. And you can see, you know, it's apparent, especially in the top left, how many more numbers from the 100s were reported in the 500s. And similarly, many more numbers in the thousands than in the 500s. Now, within the ranges, was there a tendency to report more on the higher edge, the lower edge? There seems to be a little bit more of a tendency to report on the lower edge of the range, but there was nothing reliable that we could really pull out of it. Right, there seems to be a little bit more weight on the left side of the range, but we don't have enough to say about that. Okay. The other thing that we did, like when we do we had people estimate the mean of the different doors. And so they have to estimate the mean of the high door and mean of the low door. So in this case, what people did is for the high door, they overestimated the average as compared to the safe one, right? So the idea is it's as though their estimate of the value of that door is pulled up by the higher extreme, the numbers from the highest range. And then for the low door, which had, you know, the hundreds and 500s in it, their estimate was lower than it was for the equivalent safe door, again, being drawn downward. So those were our two measures here in terms of how people's memory of what happened to them. One is a judgment and one is an explicit free recall, are both pushed towards, in this case, towards the extreme edges. So in this case, what's happening on every trial, they're getting a door with a specific outcome. And as I said before, one of the things we think is that somehow when they're storing these, they actually end up with a bias of some sort. Initially, we thought it would be more of an instance memory. That's how we thought about it going into the experiment. We don't think that quite anymore. Now we think it's more of a gist memory in the sense that they see the number and they remember something like it's in the 500s. Right. And then when the time comes to reproduce a number, they go, oh, the red door, that was the one that gave me hundreds and 500s. I'll invent a number that's in the hundreds or the 500s. Right. And they come up, they generate a number on the basis of that. So that's what we're currently thinking in terms of, you know, how it works. The key takeaway, in case you were worried and needed a very short piece, is that we're thinking that people when they're doing these sorts of things, aren't remembering individual instances of things that happen, but in fact are perhaps generalizing. Now the question is of, you know, again, they had 200 instances here. Maybe they created this gist memory when they had lots of them. What would happen if you only gave them 4 trials or something like that? Then obviously they have to remember instances. Well, no, not obviously. Maybe they remember instances, but we haven't quite done that yet. Okay, so that's what I want to say about that point. That the extreme outcomes, that they're overweighted in choice, they're better remembered, It depends on the encoding context. And people have these biased memories that are not veridical, right? So they're pushed, they tend to remember things that happen more towards the extremes, including in ranges or real numbers. But when it's drawn from a number, they don't actually remember that particular outcome, but rather remember perhaps more of a gist of what happened. Okay, now for the last point, I see I'm watching the time to stay in the zone. I'm trying to decide how I want to cover the last couple of bits. What I want to do is I want to show a little bit of the generality of this and push in a couple of directions of some of the things we've been doing recently. And so I have two bits. Okay, we'll see what we'll cover it. Okay, so the two bits that I want to tell you is I'll tell you in advance so you know where I'm going. The last two bits that I want to show you is I want to show that this sort of overweighting of extremes is a sort of thing that you also see in non-human animals. So it seems to be something that it's actually a very basic process that doesn't seem to be something especially human. Obviously, animals aren't remembering numbers and confabulating outcomes. However, they can remember different varying food amounts, which I'll show you in a second. And then the last thing that I want to show is that we've also generalized this recently to dealing with effort levels, and that you also see similar patterns when people are engaging in an effortful task and generalizing from that. So now that I foreshadowed the last couple of bits, you can tune out while I tell you about it in the next 5 minutes, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so to find out if other animals show a similar type of pattern, we've done this now with two different animals. The first one we did a couple of experiments with pigeons a few years ago. Very similar design as to what you might see with people, except we did it with birds. And what we do with the birds is they have these different kind of blockades that prevent them from seeing around them. And they could choose to go behind the yellow one or behind the green one, or another choice, they might be able to go behind the orange one or the purple one. And the layout was exactly the same, right? 1 versus 0 and 2, 3 versus 2 and 4. Very similar to the design we did with people. This is what it looks like when a pigeon does this. You can watch a little video and see how it goes. The pigeon runs in, picks the yellow one, in this case correctly, because it actually had 4 food pods behind it. Behind the orange one, there's probably 2, but you can't see it from this angle. And pigeon eats its food, then waits, goes back outside, and repeat. And the pigeon does this up to 16 times in a day until they get full or give up or fly away or do whatever pigeons want to do for that day. But you can actually do this repeatedly and get a sense of what pigeons prefer in a similar layout. So this is a different sample with the people, but you actually see that when you do that with people, we did it again with doors and money. We did not do it with food. There are other ways that we did it with people to make it a little bit more similar, where they actually had to like poke at a screen and things, and we get similar results. But I won't belabor that point. But the point is that you also see this sort of overweighting of the high outcome with pigeons. We didn't do a memory test with the pigeons, but we see behaviorally in the choice very similar between people and the pigeons. One thing that's different, just something to keep in mind, is that one thing that matters a lot for pigeons, more so than for people, is that, and it's the same thing with chimpanzees also, the 0 outcomes matter a lot more. So when you have one of the outcomes is no food, that matters a lot. Pigeons really, 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 really hate no food in a way that people don't care much, right? For humans, a low extreme, if it's a 5 or a 0 or a minus, right? The low extreme is the low extreme. It doesn't seem to matter all that much. For pigeons, if the low is 1 or the low is 0 is dramatically different. And so here's what it looks like when a low is 0. And there's what it looked like when the low didn't have a 0 involved. You had the effect was still in the same direction. But with the sample we had with the number of birds, it wasn't significant, but it was also, it was clearly greatly reduced. The effect mostly disappears when you have pigeons without a 0 involved.
May I ask a question at this point? Apologies. Yeah. I just want to know if this refers to reference point in prospect theory and whether you've integrated individualized reference points when you look at losses and gains.
So it could have, certainly it could have to do with reference points. In terms of the more detail, there aren't enough possible options to really know if it's something, right, to try and like fit prospect theory to this and try and estimate whether that's the right way of thinking about it. But it's certainly related to the idea of a reference point. Let me hold the question until I guess the question period, so I can finish my last 2 slides, if that's all right. Okay. So oh yeah, so then we also did this with chimps, and this is just showing the chimps with a 0, and they're picking, when there is a 0, they're picking the risky option about 40% of the time. The plot for the without a 0 is from the literature, and I tried to put it up earlier, and it turns out that they plotted it backwards in the literature compared to how we plotted it. They put proportion of fixed instead of risky, and it just made everything more confusing than even just me telling you about it. So let me tell you this way: if there is no 0, chimpanzees are very, very seeking. If there is the 0, then chimpanzees are more risk averse, just like the pigeons. And so there's this sort of parallel, right, that yes, you have this sort of effective extremes in other animals, but there's a difference in that there's a special effect of 0 in a way that humans aren't as sensitive to. Getting nothing is maybe humans would be sensitive if it was about food and not money. But certainly when you have animals and food, the fact that you get nothing is qualitatively different in a slightly different way. Okay. And then for the last thing that I wanted to tell you about is I just wanted to tell you that, so we've kind of extended into a couple of domains. One is we've looked at how other non-human animals look in similar domains. And then the last thing most recent thing we did, and this is a paper that was just accepted last week into decision, was we did, again, the same sort of design, except now instead of rewards, you had an effort task. And so to make a quantifiable effort task, the effort task was a clicking task, not the most exciting task, but it's meant to be boring and effortful. So it is not necessarily the best thing to have, for the participants. They might have been a little bit bored, but yes, that's good. And they had to, again, pick between either hard effort rounds where the clicks are the most, or easy effort rounds where the clicks are lower. Again, 50-50, balanced for expected effort levels. Notice one difference here, though. The biggest numbers are the worst, right? The more effort you have, the worse that it is. So you would go through the task, you would pick, let's say they picked the blue door, you'd have to click and you'd have to chase this black dot around the screen for your effort task, and then you'd move on to the next round. And you would do this, I think we did it 90 times in the course of the experiment. So enough for them to have some experience and to really want to pick the lower, well, most people wanted to pick the lower effort option. There was an interesting subset of people who picked the higher effort option, but I'm not going to talk about them here.
Do they know how many clicks, or they just click until they get a reward? They don't know it ahead.
We did it both ways. So we did it once, in one of the versions, they just clicked and they didn't get anything about it, right? So they pressed the blue door and they would just click until they were done. And the other time they would be like, click the blue door, you have to make 7 clicks, and then you'd have to make 7 clicks. So we did both of those, and the effects are similar in both these cases. The plot I'm showing you does not tell them how many they have. So it's just press a door, have to make clicks. Finish your clicks, get money at the end of the experiment, fixed amount. Okay, so the main thing that you see in effort levels, people are mostly risk neutral for the easier ones, very similar to what we see with the gains, and they were risk averse for the hard ones. So the ones that involve the possibility of having to click 11 times in that problem, they were very risk averse. Between 7 and 11 versus 9, they really avoided the hard one. 1, 5 versus 3, they didn't really care that much in this case. When we looked at we did the same sort of thing with our typical memory test. We both did remembered frequency and first outcome. And the easy ones, there wasn't that much of a difference actually between the 1 and the 5. But the thing that stood out, and that they both overjudged its frequency and indicated that it was the first to come to mind, was the hardest effort option. So there's something, at least in the effort space, it's a little more asymmetrical than we've seen in the gain space. Now, remember, I showed you the loss effects tended to be bigger than the gain effects. So it does align with that. So again, in this sort of case, they're doing a completely different type of experience, right? So now this is not getting money or anything like that, right? What they're doing is they actually have to judge between varying effort levels, right? You have to decide, do you want to pick the one that's going to give you a guaranteed amount, this amount of work, or a 50-50 chance of more work or less work for the same amount of money at the end. So that's what they do. Okay, so overall summary, extreme outcomes, overweight in choice, better remembered, also other animals and other domains. So if you have one takeaway, I want you to remember that extremes matter in memory and choice. If you want 4 takeaways, the first takeaway, the fourth sub takeaway I actually didn't talk about today, but what defines what seems to be how close it is to the actual edge, but I'm not going to talk about that. But it seems to be learned at encoding. The extremes matter even when they're not explicitly remembered, right? So even if you can't actually remember the explicit outcomes, and this seems to be fairly general across species and domains. So it's the sort of thing that we actually see in these sorts of decisions from experience tasks with money and people, but we also see it in non-human animals, and we also see it when you start working with other domains such as effort. So that's all I want to say for today, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Elliot. So we'll proceed with a few questions now. I already see that there are a few raised up hands. So we'll have a few questions now, and then those who have to leave will leave at 4 Israeli time. And if it's fine with you, you will stay for 15 or 20 minutes more for those who still want to ask questions. Ida, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to ask a question that if the late David Schmeidler was here, maybe he would ask it. Your results are convincing, but when you think about the applications, they appear to be inconsistent. If you think about the implications, they are inconsistent with the results that people underweight extreme outcomes. So your experimental paradigm is different in which you find that overweighting of rare event. It's different than the paradigm in which you find underweighting of rare event, but most real life situation falls between these paradigms. So it's very rare that you always see the same problem again and again. In natural setting, you see maybe more similar to your paradigm. So one could say, well, Elliot results are very nice, but then all this underweighting of rare event guys waste our time. They have no implication at all. Now, I don't believe that this is a case, but I want to hear what you think.
So I don't believe that's the case either. And in fact, we've collected data, and even with Ori also, we've collected data on this Ori and Kinneret we did a while ago. We never did anything with that, but we do have data that these things interact. So if you okay, so I'll do 2 things. If you try and do rare events using our type of protocol, you get underweighting of rare events. So it does you still get that, and it actually is even more potent than the effective extremes. So that's there. So we've done experiments where we have rare events that are extreme or not extreme, and then see how much they're underweighted, and they are less underweighted if they are also extreme. Right, so these things interact in exactly the way that you'd expect them to, and then we tried, So in short, they interact exactly as you might expect, and in fact, the underweighting of rare events is actually, I think, a stronger effect than the effective extremes, in the sense that it doesn't go away when the underweighted event is extreme. It's just less underweighted than if the underweighted event is not an extreme, right? So you can imagine that, right? Yeah, so we've done that as a design, and that does seem to be the case, and that is not published. It has appeared in the conference at the Technion, and has been sitting on the shelf for several years, not written up yet.
Okay, thanks.
Merit.
So here's one comment about that. It might be that you can think about the two phenomena together in the way that we would like to think about it in the reliance on small samples mechanism, because I'm just suggesting, thinking aloud here, that maybe there is some kind of tendency to rely on small samples, but once you have the small samples, the extreme are more important.
Yeah.
So
that will be an elegant explanation.
Yeah, so that's it's a really nice answer, and it's part of the, I mean, I think it's a really good way of thinking about it. That's exactly right. The idea is that if you are assuming that you are drawing a sample from memory, right, you get the underweighting because of the small sample, but you're less likely to get that underweighting if, as in the sample is more likely to have an extreme outcome in it. So it takes down that sort of underweighting effect, right? That their small sample is more likely to end up with, right, because it's overrepresented in memory. So I think it's exactly the right way to think about how these things could interact. How to test that idea, I'm not sure, but I definitely think that's the.
We have the data, right? We can just try to feed the model now.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
David?
Oh, is that me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe.
hi, great. Hi, Elliot, great. Lovely
Yeah.
to hear how you've developed this work. It's really impressive. You talked about, memory for instances versus gist. And of
Yeah.
course, it's really tough to theoretically distinguish between those. But I wondered whether there's any scope for an experimental manipulation where you individuate each reward even further. So for example, there's an irrelevant face of an individual person that accompanies each particular reward value. And then you've got some scope for probing participants' instance memory. Do they remember the reward that was associated with a particular face? I mean, you could imagine it becoming, I guess, quite a difficult experiment. So you might need to keep the number of trials down. But that would be the kind of thing that would give you a handle on looking at the extent of memory for individual reward events.
Yeah, so Aaron Bornstein did something like that, where he had bandits with individual images, like trial unique images, and people were able to trial unique, if I remember right, and I'm trying to remember the experiment, it was like 4 or 5 years ago, but the trial unique images, when people were, that's what it was, when people were primed with the trial unique images, it influenced their gambling. Right, so there was some influence of the instance, but it wasn't a pure recall of the instance, right? So imagine you showed people, I'm remembering as I speak, people had to make 100 choices between different bandits. Sometimes they'd win more, sometimes they'd lose more. Each of those rounds came with a trial unique image. Then at the end, you show them one of those trial unique images and say, which one do you want? And if it was from a winning trial, they'd be more likely to take it. If it was from a losing trial, then they'd be less likely to. That's not to say that, that's not an explicit memory of it, but it has some influence. We know, yes, we definitely know any issues related to priming, of course, but it's a different type. But this is what you're suggesting is a little bit different, right? You're suggesting also having essentially the individual numbers tied with
yeah, I mean, and you could repeat them. I mean, you could have the same face reward pairing appear more than once. I mean, they don't all have to be unique, do they?
So for this one, they were attempted to be trial unique on purpose, right? So that was part of the design, was not to have sets of repeating numbers. But yeah, that would be interesting to do. The other thing I think we could do in terms of reducing or increasing the likelihood of memory in this case, I mentioned this sort of as I was talking, is just reducing the number, right? So 200 rounds and then asking them memory questions is very different than 8 rounds and then asking them memory questions, right? Or 16 or 32 or there's, I mean, I'm just powers of 2 there, but any number of that's a right, and that'll kind of answer the question of, I mean, because presumably if you show them one, at the extreme, you show them one number and show them once, red door 372, and then ask them, remember what numbers did you see with the red door? if they're paying attention at all, they'll say 372, right? It's only when it starts getting up there, right, that they have to start kind of making up rules, generalizing, and then losing the instances, I think, in that case.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Peter?
So, okay, that's me. Yeah. To what extent is what you presented relevant to the literature on human memory?
I'm not sure it teaches us anything that new about human memory, except that it extends into these other domains, in the sense that, I mean, people kind of know, and I mean, there are other studies in human memory that people tend to remember the highest rewarded and lowest rewarded phenomena. In fact, that's some of the work of my collaborator, Chris Madan, has specifically shown that. There are other papers out there. The other thing in human memory that people look at is in terms of prediction error coding, that bigger prediction errors tend to lead to better memory as well. It doesn't quite work in our case because the prediction errors are symmetrical. So that wouldn't necessarily be something that we would see. But the idea that so the idea is out there in the literature, right? I mean, there's lots of things that people think, you know, the human memory literature is big, and there's lots of phenomena of what makes something more memorable. Are we showing something fundamentally new to a memory researcher? Maybe. I think it's not. I think it's more interesting to a decision researcher than it would be than to a memory researcher. That would be my read on the relative impact. It's in some ways we're kind of drawing on more kind of known things in memory and showing how they how they make a difference when we're actually choosing. That's my read on that.
Okay, thanks.
Kinnared's hypothesis may be new for memory researcher.
Which one?
Kinnared's explanation of the results. The fact that you might not remember the extreme, but if you remember them, then you will overweight them.
If you
What
remember.
about remembering?
You guys should look at the memory literature.
Yeah. It's a big literature. I see that Ori has his hand, but I don't know the ordering. I don't see anything except for a hand.
Yeah, don't take my job. Otherwise, I will not get my salary.
Okay, Eugene, go call out the next person. I will wait here quietly.
I just want to say you are doing an excellent job. It's fine. I just want to say for those who have to go, this is the time to go. You can also look at the chat. There are a few interesting comments there about one interesting paper and the Kotiv's comment. And now, Ori, the floor is yours for the question.
Yeah, so thanks. You call the overweighting of extremes a new maybe description experience gap. Have you ever tried looking what happens when you get a repeated description type of paradigm?
So when we did the description experience, the way we did it more than once, but one of the times we did, or more than one of the times we did it, it was repeated description against experience.
So in repeated description, you get the
That's right. So yeah, so when we did repeated description, we got, that's the plot that I showed right at the beginning was repeated description against repeated experience.
Wait, repeated description is with feedback or without?
Without.
Oh, okay. No. So I was referring to a repeated description plus feedback.
Okay. I know Manos and Leo have been working on that a lot, but I have never run, I don't think we've ever run an experiment of description with feedback that I can think of. Right, but
I think this is relevant because so I think this is relevant because you say that if it's a gap between description and experience, and you said, well, it makes sense because in experience you have only your memory to rely on. Yes. This is why you need to know what's in memory, and those are the extreme outcomes. What happens if you have a combination? But if it's a repeated description with feedback, you don't have to rely on your memory, but you still might get the same feedback. At least my prediction is that you get the same feedback phenomena as without description.
So I agree with you because of the papers that have looked at description experience, which tend to find that with, if you give feedback to description, eventually the choices look like experience. Not always, but most of the time that tends to be the case. So I would think so, but nobody's done it in our type of protocol. So I guess that's just an open question, and maybe I should hassle Manos at our lab meeting next week, but that's something we should do. Because
but then the question would be whether people would learn to ignore the description, or simply they would look on some kind of patterns in the feedback, right? So it's different accounts for why the feedback will override.
Why? That's right. So why is it that people do that? Is it because I think that people just end up ignoring the description, because there's, in some ways, my intuition is that your own experience is more reliable than a description. That people, when you have experience, then you believe it more so than you believe what's written. Which, in a lot of parts of the world becomes sometimes a problem, right? When you can only rely on anecdotes or small samples, whereas, you ignore the bulk of scientific evidence or otherwise, which is not from your own experience, but is written down.
But on the other hand, you learn to ignore very false information too, which might be a good thing, right?
That's true, although people seem to be very bad at that too. In terms of ignoring false information and relying, right? It's sort of like, you don't believe your own eyes, right? You have to, right? Because in some ways, the descriptions are always a funny thing, because they're of questionable trustworthiness at all times, right? I mean, all you know is that this experimenter person, or if it's online, this computer written thing is telling you that this is what is going to happen. Right, and if you get experience that doesn't agree with that, then you'll. I mean, yeah. So there's also lots of questions that people have done stuff also looking at, like, source attribution and descriptions and things like that, which I imagine, I don't know that obviously literature very well, but I know it's out there.
Was the memory retrieval task incentive based?
The memory task is not incentive based. I mean, especially I guess the frequency one, we could have made it incentive based, right? In that it could have been, we will pay you based on how close you are to the true frequency that you experienced. We never did do that. The other one, well, there's no sense in which it could be incentivized because there's no correct answer. But yeah, it's true. We could have done the frequency judgment, which is a pseudo memory task, as an incentivized one. And as far as I can remember, we never did.
And what is your explanation? I was wondering, for those people who click in the effort tab, who click on the doors that require more effort.
So that's a good question. We had a fair number of people across experiments, usually on the order of a quarter or a third. And there is a whole literature on the effort paradox and what they call in the animal literature contra freeloading, which is the unusual thing of when people prefer more efforts to less. Now they tend to be in situations where something good can come of your effort, or you're building something and you get more of a sense of completion out of it. It tends not to be in an online clicking task. And I know other people have kind of looked for it. I know Ben has been looking for effort tasks where people go the opposite, and I'm not seeing that much. But we've found a surprising number of people go the wrong way. What's interesting, so it's only a small subset, and they actually tend to show the opposite pattern, in the sense that they are more risk-seeking for the high effort ones than the low effort ones. So those, it's not, I don't want to say too much because, we're talking about, 10% of this, I don't know what it is, 10, 15% of the sample. It's not a big enough sample size to make a good firm conclusion, but it tends to go the other way. We've also done the effort one, and I don't talk about it here, but this is what we're working on now. We did the effort one as a described one, and it actually plays out beautifully in the described case. That's one of the things that we're working on, including with the high effort choosers showing a full reversal. People do really, care about the variance in effort and the risk in effort, and they really, in some ways, really do treat it. Most people do treat it like, the opposite of wins, so like losses, right? More is bad and less is good. But the subset of people who do the opposite also do the opposite in the risk preference, and that's true both in experience and description. So, why do people do that? In this sort of thing, I don't know. I defer to my kids who do things like practice clicking as an activity when they're trying to figure out how to get faster in their little video games, and drag clicking and butterfly clicking and all sorts of other things. That maybe that's just a entertaining, relaxing activity to be a better gamer of some sort. But I don't have a very strong sense. We tried once, and it's not in the paper, but we did try one. This is in the described one. We tried a mental effort one, and that one, very few people were actually willing to exert more effort. So clicking, we actually had a fair number of people who were willing to exert the high effort, but it was like, simple, kind of math problem type things. Nobody was willing to pick the high effort one, at least online. So that was what we observed.
Yeah. Manos, I thought that I saw that you unmuted yourself.
Can I just say a small?
Yeah.
So Elliot, I think we briefly discussed on that, but if you could create or develop a sampling analog of this task, wouldn't that partially address Kinneret's point or the mechanism of how potentially this thing unfolds? Because technically you take samples and then finally you're given a choice between, well, two options. And then in this case, you would have these small samples that you can store in memory, but then potentially the extreme is overweighted in this case.
I would just say that it might be that something else is going on when you take active sampling might be very different from this kind of implicit sampling process that we do. So I'm not sure that this will answer the same question. It is interesting, though. It can produce, I guess, so my prediction would be that it will produce the underweighting and the extreme together and their interaction, right? But I'm not sure that this will necessarily imply that this is the process in the repeated choice task. It could be, though.
Yeah, I actually think that Manos' method may work, because we have results that showing in the sampling part, if you play sampling paradigm repeatedly, initially you do have a tendency to overweight what's in your sample, but eventually this is sometimes reduced by experience. So not 100% sure it will happen, but in theory that there is some probability that will shed light on that. But it's not will be the same task, of course, because sampling is different.
So one thought about that is that if the kind of the small samples, as Orion Ido and me in the paper suggest, it's because of the pattern seeking. So we do find my recent paper with the one who was still here. So we do show that there is some pattern seeking within the sampling paradigm, but it's because the experience, because you have much less experiences, it is much weaker. So it could be that the underweighting there is driven more by the active the small sample itself than by the pattern seeking in this case.
Yeah, the hard part with us doing the sampling here, we haven't figured out quite how to, well, I guess you could just alternate what you take samples from, right? That you give them, right? Here's one, here's another, here's this one, and then I guess you could do it like that, right? Because you have to have more than two options, right? The typical sampling part, right? The standard sampling protocol is two options from the screen. You pick from A, you pick from B, you make a choice, right? We can't do it like that because then you wouldn't get you wouldn't have the possibility of the effect of the extremes. You need more than 2 options for that to happen, right? You need to have, right? So we need 4 of them, but you can't just put them all up at the screen at the same time because 2 of them are losses and 2 of them are gains, and they're never going to sample from the lot. Well, right, they're going to preferentially, I don't know what they would do actually, but they might immediately discard the ones that are, so you'd have to have some system of doing it. It's a good question, and it would be, the design is not that straightforward, which makes it interesting perhaps.
But Elliot, what we can do, it's a new idea. Maybe we can alternate between problems
I mean,
within the sampling paradigm.
yeah, something like that, right? In terms of the sampling, right? Or it doesn't, yeah, something like that. The problem is how do you'd have to do forced sampling in some sort, because the free sampling, it's kind of hard because right, again, because not all the options are available at all times. So there's enough complications that make it a little tricky to get a good design together, but not impossible.
Not impossible.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, last call for last questions. Okay, I want to thank Ido. You wanted to say something?
No. So I just want to say thank Elliot.
Well,
Thank you, Elliot. It was a
you.
great talk. Very interesting. Thank you for coming.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you,
Elliot.
everybody, for listening. Good to see you guys.
Yes, good to see you.
And see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.